This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Monday, and that means it's time for the 509th MTG Top 10. In this series, I typically rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Sometimes though, I also like to look at awful cards, and that's what we're going to be doing today, with my picks for the worst goblins in all of Magic. A couple of weeks ago I did a list on the worst elves in Magic, and people seemed to like that. So I thought it would be interesting to take a look at the worst cards in some of the other representative creature types. If you don't know what those are, that's a designation Wizards of the Coast uses for one creature type in each color. Generally, they are humanoid creatures who appear in large numbers across Magic's multiverse. Green is elves, red is goblins, blue is merfolk, and so on. Each of these creature types has a ton of cards and has even received a ton of tribal support over the years, so much so that there are tribal decks built around them in multiple formats. In the past, I've talked about how great goblins are in an MTG Top 10 and a deck history video that covered them. But there are so many goblins in this game that there are also a lot of terrible ones, and that's what we're going to see in this video. To make it on this list, a card had to have never been played at a significant Magic tournament, and it also can't be widely played in EDH. The cards on this list also can't be cards that make the cut in Limited. Ultimately, the cards on this list and the order they appear in is based on my own opinion, but I do use that little bit of data to help me make my picks. Alright, let's dive in with a look at the 10 worst goblins ever printed. At number 10, it is Goblin Flotilla. This has Grey Ogre's stats, which isn't too bad, and it even has some upside, albeit narrow upside in the form of Island Walk. Unfortunately, the Flotilla also comes with some pretty big downside. Anytime it attacks or blocks, you have to pay a single red mana, otherwise the things that it blocks or that are blocking it gain first strike. The fact you have to do it before combat is especially awful. It would be a lot better if you could wait until it was blocked or being blocked to pay that cost. So, yeah, this means that just to trade the Flotilla with another 2-power creature, you have to make a pretty significant mana investment, and that's pretty awful. At number 9, it is MOG Jailer. You get a 2-mana 2/2 with this card, but it has a massive downside. It can't attack if your opponent has an untapped creature with power 2 or less. That's really awkward, since those are exactly the situations when you want to be attacking with your 2-mana 2/2, since it would normally mean the best your opponent can do is trade. So basically, the Jailer can only attack when you don't want to be attacking with a 2/2, because it will just die in combat without killing anything your opponent controls. MOG Jailer basically needs an empty board to take full advantage of its unimpressive Grizzly Bear stats, and that kind of setup isn't worth the payoff. At number 8, I have Exiled Bogart. Most of the cards on this list are red, but in Lorwyn block we saw a lot of black goblins like the Bogart here. As I've already said for the first 2 cards we've seen, this has decent stats, but an awful downside. When it dies, you have to discard a card. And I know, people in the comments are furiously typing right now about how this gives you a discard outlet for madness and helps you put reanimation targets in your graveyard, and that's true. You can turn this downside into upside in the right deck, but the fail case for this card is too bad for that to matter. Even in a deck built with discarding cards in mind, you won't always have something you want to discard when this dies, so while the upside is there, you'd much rather have a card where you have far more control over when you discard the card, and not a card that lets your opponent turn a removal spell into a 2-for-1. That's why, even in EDH, a format where there are plenty of decks that want to discard cards, hardly anyone plays Exiled Bogart. At number 7, it is Goblin Sappers. This one does not have good stats as a 2-mana 1/1, but it does have a text box that gives it some utility. You can pay 2 red mana to make another creature unblockable for a turn. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, it would be if your Sappers and the creature you made unblockable didn't both die at the end of that combat. That means you are 2-for-1ing yourself for 1 unblocked hit, and while that can be nice in some specific situations, it's a lot like Exiled Bogart. If you're looking to make creatures hard to block, there are hundreds of better ways to do it that don't make you bet the farm on it. It does have a second ability that costs 4 red and also makes a creature unblockable, and in that situation you do get to hold on to the Sappers, but the creature you made unblockable still gets destroyed. Sure, you could sort of look at this as a very roundabout sacrifice outlet, but once again, there are hundreds of better ways to sacrifice creatures, and many of them don't cost any mana. Note, by the way, that the Sappers doesn't technically sacrifice itself or the other creature. Both are destroyed, so while you can get some triggers for creatures dying, you don't get any triggers that check for when a creature or permanent is sacrificed, further limiting the number of places you actually want to play this card. At number 6, it is Wandering Goblins. This starts out as an awful 3 mana 0/3, but hey, it can raise its power. If you pay 3 mana, it gets +1/+0 for each basic land type among lands you control, so yeah, this goblin wants you to be going the 5 color route to get the full value out of it, and even when you do that, you pay 3 to give this +5/+0. You can use it more than once, so in a deck specifically made to get domain going and produce mana, it can have some massive power, but the setup is massive for such a small payoff, and the base creature is awful. Anything with 3 powers still trades for it quite easily, and lots of 1 mana removal can kill it too, even in that ideal situation. At number 5, it is Goblin Machinist. Like Wandering Goblins, Goblin Machinist comes with awful base stats and has the ability to buff its power. In this case, you get a 5 mana 0/5 and you can pay 3 mana and reveal cards until you reveal a non-land, at which point the Machinist gets +X/+0, where X is that card's mana value. So, sure, you can manipulate the top of your library to make this thing have huge power, but you're still doing some serious setup for a card that will only have a fairly minimal impact on the game. Sinking your mana into that effect is almost never going to be worth it when you could just be playing out permanents or using your mana to draw cards. Now, the one thing it does do, and the reason it's played more than any other goblin on this list, is that it allows you to put the cards in any order on the bottom of your library. This allows you to set up Grenzo, Dungeon Warden's ability, to grab stuff from the bottom of your library, but even then, only 33 of 2,055 Grenzo decks on EDHREC run the Goblin. That's 1.6% of them, and the other 98.4% are doing it right, because there are dozens of better ways to mess with the bottom of your library. At number 4, it is Goblin Rock Sled. Another goblin that does reasonably well on the vanilla test since it's a 2 mana 3/1, and it even comes with Trample. That next block of text is all super significant downside though. For one thing, it can only attack if your opponent controls a mountain. Second, it doesn't untap during your untap step if it attacked during your last turn. You want to be attacking with your 2 mana 3/1 with Trample, but this only lets you do it every other turn. The one thing going for the Sled is that it can trade for stuff by blocking, but that just isn't what you want to be doing with your 3/1. At number 3, it is Marsh Goblins. This is a 2 mana 1/1 that costs 2 different colors of mana. A card has to have a pretty great text box to overcome such an abysmal stat line, and this doesn't have it. It comes with Swamp Walk, and that's it. Even if you want to say this is a sideboard card, it isn't like a 2 mana 1/1 with Swamp Walk is ever going to fill any opponent with fear when they have a swamp in play, and that's the ideal situation for the card. At number 2, it is Bog Hoodlums. This is a 6 mana 4/1 that can't block. When it enters the battlefield, you do clash with your opponent, which means you and your opponent both reveal the top card of your libraries, and whomever has the higher mana value wins the clash. And if you win that clash, it becomes a 5/2 that can't block. So, yeah, even if you manage to make everything go perfectly, it's still a bad card, and you aren't even close to guaranteed to get that +1/+1 counter. It really feels like they meant to give this haste if you won the clash too, or maybe it could block if it had a counter on it. It really just seems like a line of text is missing somewhere because this is so woefully overcosted. But I do think there is one goblin that's even worse. And that's our number 1 card, MOG Squad. This 2 mana 3/3 might get you excited at first, but then you'll realize the downside on the card is impossible to overcome. It gets -1/-1 for each other creature in play. This means that it basically doesn't want you or your opponent to be playing creatures, and those are things that are just going to happen over the course of every single Magic game. Your opponent basically gets to kill the squad for free eventually, simply by having 3 creatures in play, and that is a big problem. So, yeah, for this to do well, it asks for you to control something you don't have that much control over. How many creatures are in your opponent's deck? Sure, you can make your deck have no creatures in it at all, so this won't die from your creatures, But that's a pretty big cost to pay for something so mediocre. This thing is just awful, and will often amount to paying 2 mana for the privilege to put it directly into your graveyard. So, those are my picks for the 10 worst goblins in all of Magic. Do you think I missed any? Let me know in the comments. If you want to own any of the cards that appeared on this list for some reason, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them. If you want to make sure you stay aware of future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the almost 500 other MTG Top 10s, including many more on awful cards, you should see the playlists on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can by becoming a patron or a channel member, or by buying Nitsahone merch. You can find ways to do all of those things in the description. Thanks for watching.